So oftentimes you might want to use a nice subtle 3D effect on, let's say, an image or an interface element. And previously you would have to do those types of simple 3D types of things using Flash. But now with CSS3 we have the ability to do these things directly using CSS. So this is what we're going to be building. It's just a baseball card of Kenny Powers here. And when I click on it, it actually does a 3D flip so that I can see the back of the card. Again, nothing really crazy, and I can keep clicking on it here. Just a simple 3D flip, and this is obviously using two separate images. But this, again, we're able to now do this directly in the browser with CSS3. And on a lot of platforms, this is also hardware accelerated. So for instance, this would run pretty nicely also like on an iOS device in the browser. So when it comes to CSS transforms, especially the 3D type, we want to see what type of browser support that has. So we're going to go to caniuse.com and just go down to 3D transforms. And we can see with this table, if we go into the current browser set, IE9 doesn't support it, but it is supported in 10. So you can get the 10 beta. It's supported in Firefox 14, Chrome 21, Safari 6. It's not supported on Opera, iOS Safari, it's supported, Android, it's supported, not available on BlackBerry or Opera Mini. So we can see here that there's pretty decent support for it. Again, this kind of is more of a cutting edge tutorial, but again, as more browsers come to support it, you'll be able to use this more and more. So I've included the two images in the tutorial files. There's the front.jpg and back.jpg. So we're going to be doing our coding in Sublime Text. And I've already created just a template HTML5 document here and saved it into the same directory as those images. Okay, so let's first worry about creating our actual HTML elements. So the first thing we're going to create is a div, which is going to be our wrapper. So when we're dealing with 3D transforms in CSS, we want to have a container, and inside of that, all of our 3D objects can live. Because on this container, we're going to need to set things like the perspective and the perspective origin, and that's going to take effect to all of the children inside this container. So I'm just going to give this an ID of wrapper. And now inside of here, I'm essentially going to create a div which is going to be my card, which represents the actual baseball card, both sides. So I'm going to create a div, and I'm going to create a class called card, because again, I might want to reuse this. Let's say I want to have 50 baseball cards on the screen. I want to make sure that I'm reusing that class. Okay, so I'm going to close that now. And now inside of here, what I want to do is to create two divs that represent those image objects. So div, I'm going to set a class on this equal to side, because there's going to share some properties between the front and the back. But I'm also going to have another CSS class specific to this element, which I'll call back. Now you could just do this directly with an image object itself, but I'm assuming we might want to put some other elements in here, like maybe a little bit of text. Okay, so inside of here, all I'm going to do is to set the image of this one equal to back.jpg, like that. And now I'm just going to copy this block, paste it in. And this one, it's going to still have a class of side, but this one will be called front, like that. So if I jump back and refresh, you can see I now have those divs that are currently obviously not positioned in 3D space, but we can see our images are actually showing. Okay, so now I want to add some CSS to this. So I'm just going to do it inside of this document. Just going to add a style block. So now we need to create those classes. So first, I have that wrapper, and that's actually a div ID. The next thing we need is the side class. Again, that's the common elements to any of the individual sides of the baseball card. And then we need one for back, and then one for front. Okay, so like I mentioned before, if we want to set things like the perspective, the 3D perspective, we need to do that in the wrapper container. And what we're going to do is, since we're testing this in Chrome, I'm only going to do the WebKit prefixes here, but we'll add the other ones at the end. So I'm going to say -WebKit, and then the first thing we need to set is the perspective. And this expects a pixel value. And again, this will determine how objects are going to look. And you can manipulate this value using the developer tools. But I'm going to set it at 500 pixels. Now, another thing we might want to set is the WebKit perspective origin. And that's where on this div do we want the origin to be. And we set essentially a width and a height. We can also give percentages. So I'm just going to give 50% on both, which is actually the default value. So we wouldn't technically have to set this. But if you want to change where the origin is for that perspective, we can do it here with this property. So that's what we need to set with the wrapper. Now we actually want to, and the one thing I need to create here is a class called card. So now we need to do the CSS for the actual card. So one thing we're going to want to do is to set the position equal to relative on this. And now I want to set the margin. So I don't want the card to be right at the top of the browser window, so I'm just going to give it a value of 100 pixels, 100 pixels for the top, and we'll say auto. So the left and the right margins are going to be set to auto. The top and the bottom are going to be set to 100 pixels. Now we want to set the height and the width. So I'm just going to give it the exact dimensions of the image. So 386 pixels, and then the width is 276 pixels. Okay, so now a very important thing that you need to add, and that is the WebKit transform style property. So WebKit transform style, and what this is going to do is it's going to control how those objects inside of this card div are actually rendered. And what we want to do is to say preserve 3D. Because if not, then all the elements inside of this div are actually going to be flattened, almost kind of like 2.5D. Everything's going to be squashed together. So if we want to preserve the 3D space of the children of this div, we need to set the preserve 3D property. Okay, so let's jump over and see if it looks any different. And already you can tell that it's actually centered now, again, because we've set the margins on our card here. Okay, so now we need to keep going through. Now we need to actually set the common elements that each of the sides of the baseball card share. So for these, we want to set position absolute. This is going to allow us to absolutely position our elements inside of this relative container here, which is our card. Now for this, I'm going to also set the width and the height. So height is 386 pixels, width 276. And now what we need to do now is to position both the back and the front in 3D space. So obviously both of them on the z-axis are at 0, 0. So if we just leave things the way they are, there's going to be some flickering because both of those objects are fighting for that position on the z-axis. So all we're going to do in the, let's start with the front. We're just going to bring that up by 1 pixel on the z-axis. That way it gets out of the way of the back image. So to do that, we're going to set the WebKit-transform property. And to this, we can provide a whole number of transform functions. The only thing we're going to do for this front is we're going to call the translate z function. This is going to allow us to move this object on the z-axis. I'm just going to move it up by 1 pixel, just so it gets out of the way of this back one. And that's all we have to set on the front image, because again, we're not doing anything, we're not really adjusting its rotation or anything like that. So now for the back, again, we need to set WebKit transform. And for this one, what we need to do is we need to rotate this 180 degrees. So what I first want to do is to say rotate Y. And to this, I want to rotate it essentially 180 degrees. I'm just going to say negative 180 degrees. And that's because when we turn the card around, we don't want to see, we will actually want to see the front of that back card so that it's actually aligned properly. Okay, so now let's go over and test it. And now you can see we have our card here, which is, the front one is positioned where it should. The back one is 1 pixel back on the z-axis and rotated. So now if we wanted to actually control this a little bit, we could actually do a transform here. And just to make sure we have it working correctly, we can say WebKit transform. And I can rotate this on the y-axis by, let's say, 25. And when we're using these transform functions, we actually pass in the units. So I'm going to pass in degrees there. And now you can see here is that container card, which is actually being positioned in 3D space. Now if I actually move it around to 90 degrees, you should see the back of the card. Oh, sorry, 180 degrees. 90 degrees, you're not going to see really anything. And there's the back of the card. So now you can see what we're actually going to be doing here is we're going to be animating this when I click to change that rotate Y property of the transform. So I can remove this here. So now I have my CSS in place. Now what I need to do is to change things when I click on the actual card. So I'm just going to remove, we're not going to use this init function here. And then on the card div tag itself, I'm going to provide an onClick event. And we'll just have it call a function called clicked. Now I'm actually going to send this element, this current div element, to this function because again we want to think about things of how to make this reusable. So let's say I had a bunch of card divs. We could actually pass in the individual element that we should animate using this property here. So I'm just going to reuse this function. I'm going to call it clicked, and we're sending in that element, which I'll just hold in a variable called e. Okay, so what we want to do in our JavaScript here is the first thing we want to do is to create a variable which we're going to call angle. So var angle is equal to 0. And we're going to be incrementing that value every time that click function is called. So I'm going to say angle plus equals 180 because we want it to rotate 180 degrees every time we click on that card. Okay, so now what we need to do is to set this transform property here using JavaScript. Well, we can do it directly on that element that I passed in. I can say e.style. And then when we want to use those prefixes from JavaScript, so for WebKit, we actually say lowercase WebKit transform, and we use camel case like that. And now to set this CSS property, we need to set it as a string here. So what I want to do is to rotate that card by what the current value of angle is. So we're going to say rotate Y, open the parentheses, and then now I'm going to concatenate onto that angle plus, then we need to add our degrees unit there. And now I can close this like that. So again, now every time we come in, we're incrementing that angle variable and then resetting the WebKit transform property here to that angle property. So let's test it now. And now you can see every time I click, it's actually rotating 180 degrees. So this is working nicely, but obviously, you know, up until this point, it hasn't really shown us a lot because there's no animation happening here. Now I could set up a request animation frame and animate it manually, but the easier way to do it is just simply to use the WebKit transitions or CSS transitions to do this animation for me. So I'm going to come to my card class up here, and I'm going to set the WebKit transition property. So WebKit transition. And we're going to use the shorthand here where essentially what we do is to pass in which CSS element do we want to animate using a transition. Well, we want to animate -WebKit -transform. So anytime that transform is changed, it's going to animate to that newly changed value. Now the next thing we pass in is how long of a time do we want that animation to take. I'm going to do 0.7 seconds. Now for an easing style, there are some built-in ones in CSS, which are actually pretty, well, they're pretty lame. So I can just say ease -out, you know, to get a basic easing effect. A nicer thing to do is to actually, you can go to this site, cubic-bezier.com. And what this will allow you to do is you have this curve that you can actually drag around to create your own easing effects. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this left one and I'm going to drag it up to 0.75. I'm going to take this one and I want to make sure that that last number is 1. I want to bring this to 25 like that. And now what I can do is to compare the one I created to these other ones. And now I have that nice expo type easing effect. So I'm just going to come in here and copy this line because this is actually what I need to put into my code. And all I have to do is to paste that in here. Oop, and I got a little bit of extra text along with that. So essentially we can pass in that cubic Bezier function here, which you can see here. And this allows me to have fine-tuned control over the easing effect. Okay, so let's go back to our example. And now you can see when I click, I have a nice easing effect that's happening. And since I'm incrementing that angle variable by 180 each time, it doesn't matter how many times I click on this, it's not going to get confused. It's always going to go to a multiple of 180. So again, this works really, really nicely. Now, one of the things you'll notice right away is that, okay, using WebKit prefixes, well, we can change this very easily so that it adds prefixes for other browsers. All I'm going to do is to grab all my CSS code here, copy it, and then we want to go to prefixer.com. And this is going to allow us to paste in our CSS. And then we can say prefix size. And now it's gone through and added all the other transforms that we need. So I'm going to copy this and now just paste over my CSS. And now let me just need to actually make sure it's aligned properly here. Now I did notice that there's a problem with this in that it didn't actually set these values to the other prefixed values. So you're going to need to go through and do that manually. But you can see all the other ones. It sets the WebKit, the Mozilla, Opera, Microsoft, and just the regular transition effect here. So, and let me just show you an example of how you would do this one manually. So, for example, if we want to set Moz-perspective, again, we're going to do that same thing, 500 pixels. And again, you can just copy these and put in the correct prefixes for the other browsers. Like that. So for some reason, this didn't work on Prefixer. So now we also are going to need to do those things here in JavaScript. Now, there's several libraries that are out there that allow you to that will automate a lot of this stuff for you. Obviously, you don't want to be calling unnecessary functions, but let me just show you. So I could say e-style WebKit transform, and for Mozilla, for instance, it's actually capital M-O-Z, Moz transform, to do those same things. But again, you're going to want to test for whether you're in a WebKit browser or Mozilla browser, and only do the correct call. That's definitely something you want to do. So check out some of those other libraries that allow you to do that. But you can see, very, very simple to create some nice 3D transition effects using the CSS 3D transforms.